it is very possible to grow to a degree, to heal to a degree, where you're able to stop those abuses.
And here we go. The last of the attachment strategies, categories,
Introductions.
intros.
It's the rarest.
Mm-hmm.
And B, it's usually, but not exclusively, associated with some severe and chronic mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
and thus may not present in your typical outpatient private practice.
Right.
But it's very possible and does.
And does.
Yes.
It absolutely does. Yeah, but like I was telling you earlier, I think in my reading, what I found is that in the general population, it's usually recorded very low. So the numbers that are coming to the top of my head, it's usually like 8 to 10% of the population. I could be way off. I need to go back and look at that.
You're about right, though. I don't know it for sure.
So, but at the same time, we don't always work with the general population. We're working with people who say, hey, I need help.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it shows up more than I anticipate. But actually, I was talking to a colleague of ours, I was staffing a case the other day, and he was talking about in y'all's consultation, how when studying the AAI, how you guys are often surprised how many of your caseload is, we haven't even named it yet, disorganized.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how does the disorganized attachment
Mm-hmm.
style? Has that been the case? Or was he lying?
Yeah, no. Yeah. He was telling the truth. Yeah, it's that sort of slightly deceptive that it's not always matched with poor coping skills across the board and across domains of life, and various, I think, variables like strong family support or strong financial resources can really modulate and mask the kind of mind that a disorganized, attached mind is. But yeah, no, that's been fun. And in the piece, how it makes sense.
I'm just aware that I left the music on. Sorry.
I didn't even, that's how much I'm losing my hearing.
It wasn't that loud, but with the ambulance in the background and the music, I was like, we're just having a cacophony of.
One of my favorite words.
Oh, really?
An onomatopoeia. But you say cacophony.
I don't often say it.
But when I do.
But when I do. Uh-huh.
I would say cacophony.
Oh.
I don't know which is right.
We are not the guys to ask.
Also, it could be coastal on the East Coast, South, West Coast.
Yeah.
Regional accent. Yeah, so with disorganized attachment, it is also very associated with unresolved trauma. And so someone with unresolved trauma can often present for a while as being much more organized in their state of minds.
Yeah.
And it's when the rubber hits the road, it's when distress occurs, conflict in relationships, where then you'll see the disorganized attachment show up.
And how I organize the others is that view of self and view of other. And so keeping that thread going, the disorganized attachment would have that both a negative view of self and negative view of other. And so can't trust for people to be there, can't trust their own regulation or to be there for themselves as well. And so the word, while we've had many other words for a lot of the other attachment strategies and styles, disorganized seems very pronounced and very succinct.
Yeah.
It is disorganized.
Yet still a bit deceptive. And also, and actually, in the academic research, you will see disorganized / frightened.
Oh, really? I haven't seen that. Okay.
And so, again, some of the academic language can be maybe sort of confusing for folks that aren't in academia, that aren't used to reading operational terms. And so there is...
Right, because it'd be really easy to be like, oh, they're frightening. Disorganized.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Or in the researcher, author, clinician, Crittenden, I think, is most credited with really advancing the idea that there is a predictable strategy. There is an organization. It's just disorganized. It's not singular.
Interesting. Okay.
Whereas with dismissive attachment, secure attachment, or anxious, ambivalent, entangled attachment, it is more singular and consistent.
Right.
Whereas the disorganized is sometimes best understood as a combination or a vacillation that isn't always predictable, but it's predictable that there will be this pattern of a mixed strategies of dismissive, anxious.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never thought of it that way.
So this is nerding out, but I'll say it to you.
Let's go.
And others who are interested in it. So in the original development of the classification system, so Bowlby, our father, grandfather, forefather of the person who coins the term attachment or attachment bond to describe what's happening not only between infant and caregiver, but the necessity of that bonding. Bowlby isn't the one who articulates or researches classifications.
Right.
That happens with others that are studying under him. And so he strongly encourages those who are doing the classification to resist even naming, but rather just marking that there are 1, 2, 3 apparent strategies that are seeming to emerge. And so the organization of that, instead of labeling it with a characteristic, an adjective, became A, B, and C.
Right.
And so A was the dismissive, what would later be named dismissive. B is what would later be named secure. And C is what would later be named anxious. And so Crittenden describes disorganized as A/C to really highlight the combination of these two insecurely attached strategies, where one tends to be overly emotionally regulated and blunted and stunted, A, or dismissive, and the underregulation emotionally of C. And so you have this vacillating pattern or vacillating strategy, sometimes simultaneously somewhat.
Right. So when we look at this and we try to follow the formula that we've been presenting this in, we say the characteristics of, it's really all of them minus security.
Right. Yeah. So, and because it's all of them, it gives a flavor or an appearance of disorganization because it can be rapidly cycling, or it can be simultaneous, or it can be so pervasively both apparent across time or across a conversation or across an interview, i.e. the adult attachment, where you have clear patterns of both.
Yeah. So again, leaning on you, what would cause, how does that develop?
Yeah. So that much like the other classifications where they go by many names, or you'll hear various people use different names. With disorganized, you have the also / frightening or frightened. So the kind of caregiving experiences that you received was from a caregiver who was either frightened and they were in a kind of pervasive and consistent state of being
heightened state,
a heightened state, and a consistent state, persistent state of being frightened themselves, stressed. And when you're frightened, it's hard to be, if not impossible, present, regulated, and attuned to an infant, a toddler, a child's needs. And when a caregiver is frightened themselves and thus unavailable, that is inherently frightening for the child. Even though the parent isn't being intrusively, the caregiver isn't being intrusively frightening toward the child. Their very state of being unavailable,
right.
think, still face experiment. The very fact that they are unavailable plus also very preoccupied or
with themselves
right, is frightening. But you also get the pattern, and sometimes it's both, that the caregiver is also intrusively frightening toward the child.
Mm-hmm.
And that can look like incongruent affect. So a child is injured
mm-hmm.
and the parent is laughing.
Oh.
And excessively laughing
mm-hmm.
and kind of intrusively. Sometimes it's sort of sadistic.
So confusing.
But profoundly confusing.
Yeah.
Or rapidly cycling out of that laughing into crying. Or it's those frightening kind of caregiver experiences where they are aggressive, but it doesn't have to be necessarily physically aggressive. It can also be a kind of rather anxiously driven, but intrusive and sharply intrusive.
Yeah, I'm trying to organize that in my mind of, I think we just hit on part of how we organize the other insecurities is how we respond to the unavailability of the caregiver and how we attempt to get it regulated, to get it back, to get the attention.
Yes.
To get the care needed. And so I'm having a hard time in my mind understanding that over, how did you just phrase it? Intrusivity? Is that a word?
Mm-hmm.
That intrusivity being received as unavailable because it's more about the mind of the caregiver than it is the child?
Well, in that case, it's less about whether or not the parent is or isn't available.
Mm-hmm.
They're not available clearly to meet the child's need.
Okay.
But they are clearly available in so much as they're being intrusive. So the child knows that the parent or caregiver is there,
mm-hmm.
but it's in a flooding, overwhelming, intrusive, shocking, sometimes unexpected, and
not
unanticipated.
Metabolizable.
That's right.
I'm making up words.
No, it's
you
right.
Cannot metabolize what's being given.
That's right.
Okay.
But the unavailability not only comes in the form of when the caregiver is frightened,
mm-hmm.
but then the second important quality that predicts an infant child developing disorganized attachment is when a caregiver also finds themselves in states of dissociation. And so again, think of the still face experiment.
Here, but not here.
Here, but not here. Unavailable.
Mm-hmm.
Present, but not. And then when they are present, it's a scary, intrusive, frightening, or they're so frightened.
They're unavailable. Right.
And so one of the strategies that we develop as children, when this is the kind of quality of caregiving we're receiving, is that we then learn to dissociate. And that dissociation, unfortunately, does not necessarily help the developing mind create an organized, coherent state of mind.
Mm.
In fact, it helps create a rather incoherent, inconsistent state of mind that will eventually fluctuate or be inconsistent, discontinuous sort of states of mind or states of emotion.
Yeah, it just sounds like nothing is successful.
Wonderfully said. And so one of the terms that beautiful descriptions, I think, of the child's experience, because is fright without resolution. The child is having need states because they're children.
Right.
Infant, toddlers, and humans.
Mm-hmm.
And they may have been exploring the world, crawling or walking, playing, and gotten frightened, gotten startled, gotten hurt, or gotten unsure about the proximity of their caregiver. And so they will seek that attachment behavior. They will seek proximity of the caregiver. And the caregiver becomes a source of distress. And so that child is caught between the person or persons that are here to soothe me are also the source of my distress.
Wow.
And I can't resolve this.
Right.
Fright without resolve. And that's disorganizing to a mind. And the strategies that the child will develop to deal with that is I will use anything and everything.
Right. To get out.
To get out or to get in.
To get it. Right. Yeah. That it just goes through my mind because when I'm thinking of like, that is the first strategy that we seek when we experience disconnection is to seek proximity.
Yeah.
And how terrifying that has to be that you seek proximity to what you anticipate being a safe, grounded, regulated place and is so dysregulated and so much dysregulated that it causes you fear. And so now you're sent back into your system of I need proximity, but it's just cyclical of proximity seeking for care and then fright.
And then shutting down.
Right.
While seeking proximity.
Yes.
And shutting down.
Like it makes me lose my breath.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that sounds so horrific.
And just to add another horrific sort of layer to that, it also includes when the infant child is not necessarily engaging in attachment seeking behavior or seeking proximity, but is just content. And content playing, content exploring, content just being. And then the intrusive caregiver.
Dysregulation, yeah.
The attachment need.
Yeah.
And that impulse that seems to be so genetically wired into ourselves to seek our caregivers is now caught in an unresolvable dilemma.
Oh, I love that word. It is, because that's what it is. It is a dilemma.
A terrible, tragic dilemma.
Right.
Yeah. And again, to underscore a non-judgment, non-shame posture and attitude that we both have and that attachment is.
Right. Because no one's doing this on purpose.
Even if they are doing it on purpose, even if the parent is consciously, purposely trying to frighten the child, because that can happen.
Yeah.
It's not always
it's flashing in my mind. Yeah. Okay.
By no means is it always purposeful.
Right.
And in fact, perhaps it may be more not purposeful. But even if it is purposeful, we can understand that motivation because what is often, it's not always the case. It doesn't have to be the case. But what often comes with a child's life who is receiving this kind of caregiving will be all sorts of forms of abuse. And not necessarily at the hands of the caregivers.
Right.
But often in the form of neglect,
unavailability.
Abuse, it can be physical and sexual abuse, but not necessarily by the caregivers, but by peripheral caregivers. And so it is these repeated experiences of abuse by often during multiple stages of life, of multiple stages of development, that creates such an incoherence of mind that the abuser, who is intentionally trying to startle a child, for example, is also not really coherent. They're not really interpreting the world coherently. And I'm trying to walk that line of psychotic processes, and maybe they're straddling that line of psychotic processing or a psychotic state of mind. So it's not an excuse, But it's so thoroughly understandable how a parent caregiver develops into that kind of caregiver, because they were likely a child having the same kind of caregiving that compromised their mind's capacity to think coherent, to think rational,
Right.
let alone to be aware of their own mind, let alone to be aware of their own emotional needs or even their emotional states, and an inability to understand the impact of their behavior.
Right. To be aware of the mind of the other.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or to even be aware of the concept of a mind.
Yeah.
That's where it gets real tragic.
Yeah. Like when we do this podcast, I've wanted to be playful. There's nothing seemingly playful about this.
It's not. It's a total catastrophe of development.
Right.
Yeah. And it's a catastrophe of being able to provide the developing child, what it needs. And that developing child in turn develops this disorganized attachment strategy to deal with that environment. And it's sadly the best strategy to keep them safe.
Right.
Which will include those states of dissociation in various
Absolutely. So when we talk about this, and we talk about the capacities of disorganized, it's disorganized. It's a mixed bag.
Yes. And most often in comparison to the other classifications, it's probably associated with the least amount of capacities, where their goal-directed behavior is compromised, their ability to evoke or provoke others to meet their needs, and a kind of disorganization in their psychophysical, biological, emotional. It's holistically impactful. It's tragic.
I don't like it.
Yeah, I know. I don't like it either. And what is interesting is, again, we are talking about broad categories with each of these classifications. And it's very plausible. It's very possible that listeners, your classification would be disorganized. It's very possible that you, by many accounts, are doing okay.
Sure.
And that many people may not see you at your worst moment. Or you may have somehow found yourself in some relationships with others that are way more organized in their mind and have greater capacities to regulate their emotion and co-regulate yours. Yet nevertheless, you've grown into an adult with this disorganized attachment classification that is associated with the ways in which childhood trauma or childhood abuse still has this way of impinging upon the functions of the mind. It's a way in which the old trauma sort of still lives.
Absolutely.
It's not been buried. It's not been mourned. It's not been processed. And so it's a ghost that haunts your mind and pulls your mind in certain directions without your awareness, without your consent.
Right. And has you surviving any way possible.
Yeah. And tragically causing you to have challenges in your ability to care for others, especially your own children. And so again, no blame or shame in that game. You come by it honest, and you deserve the whole world's support in healing from that attachment wound and recovering from that trauma.
And so, I don't know, to provide hope or to talk about potential hope or what there, but in the attachment theory, science, academia, what is the hope for disorganized attachment, if that is the way of learned survival and existence in the world, and we've talked about mildly in other ways, corrective emotional experiences, that to me sounds a little not enough
Sufficient.
for when we're looking at, and all these are on a spectrum, right?
Sure.
That not everyone is created equal in that. But with the disorganized attachment, what does the research say? What is the hope for healing, health, and relationship? And
yeah. So there's maybe a fine line that I want to draw out, that if you're someone as an adult that your attachment would be classified as disorganized, and in your own childhood history you have a history of physical or sexual or emotional abuse or neglect, or all of it,
mm-hmm.
and some of us do, and you have children, it is very possible that you don't replicate in your own life toward your children, and can be somewhat successful in preventing your children from experiencing those same kinds of traumas. So that's one thing that I want to make sure is clear.
Absolutely.
Where we see parents, caregivers unable to prevent that, it's not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite understandable. But it is very possible to grow to a degree, to heal to a degree, where you're able to stop those abuses, or those kinds of explicit, dramatic abuses. However, you're also still likely disorganized in your attachment, which means when we say that, we're talking about a quality of the mind, a function of the mind, and therefore we are still very capable of passing on that kind of disorganized mind into our children. And so we have to provide those adults the kind of support to heal those attachment wounds.
Accessibility, availability, reliability.
Yes.
All those things.
Consistency.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yep. So it's possible. And if someone who's listening, or of someone whose classification would likely be disorganized, I've said this to several patients across my years of practice. There is no shame, and can we just perhaps consider that we will be in therapy for the rest of our lives? And what that looks like is not always the same across our lives, and certainly doesn't mean it needs to be with the same therapist.
Right.
But it is very difficult. It just is inherently difficult to move from the disorganization to organization.
Absolutely.
It's not fair, but the dismissively attached folks are sometimes a little easier to move from their dismissive insecurity state toward a more secure state, because the dismissive attached mind tends to be over-organized,
right,
and over-regulated.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the anxiously, ambivalently entangled attached, and then even more so the disorganized attached, tends to be more disorganized, more incoherent.
Mm-hmm.
And the building of the coherence capacities is just trickier. It's just harder. It's a little easier to sort of unlock, if you will, feeling the feelings. And the anxiously attached and the disorganized attached
that are already feeling
yeah, that's right. They do not need mindfulness practice of feel your feelings. They're like, I can feel them. They're crawling all over my skin. I want to crawl out of my skin. I don't want to feel what I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're needing is emotional regulation capacities.
Mm-hmm.
And they need building blocks of coherence of the mind. And those are just harder capacities to heal and recover
Recover. It's a great word. Yeah.
To reclaim, because of all of that emotional dysregulation, tends to be an undermining force.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible. And if we, as mental health professionals, I think we should be a bit more humble and acknowledge that we've gotten it wrong 1,000 times.
I was actually just thinking, and I'm aware that I'm biased, right, to my own field of study and my own modality in which I choose to practice from. I can't imagine, though, having, maybe the general population sees therapy this way sometimes as like a one-trick pony, and like this is, you treat, like you have this goal of treating everyone, but without knowing these intricacies, the ways in which people develop, the ways in which people react to their development, and the ways in which they're attempting to survive, if you're treating all of them equally, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, because each one needs something very different.
Right.
Yes.
And so it kind of baffles me when I talk to other clinicians who have certain styles or modalities they're working from. And I'm like, the idea of everyone being mindful is not the solution.
No.
Nor is it caring or available. So,
and even worse, I would just go one step further, which is, and sometimes it's counter indicated.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it might be harmful.
Right.
And so one of the ways that we have historically treated trauma, which is also inherently just a complicated word to begin with.
Right.
Yeah.
And just add, it's not only disorganized, they can experience a history of trauma.
Yeah. That's where it gets a little more complicated for me. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll maybe leave that there for just a wonderful, beautiful sec. The historic way that we have approached healing from trauma has been asking patients to recount the trauma.
Right. And
the hope was that they need to process it. If they could talk about it enough, if they could
distill it, conceptualize it.
Yes. Get some distance from it or digest it and metabolize it. If they could get some perspective about the experience, then they'll overcome the trauma. And what we've learned is that is often re-traumatizing,
right,
and reharming and entrenching the effects of those adverse experiences, those traumatic.
Which actually is really scary to me, is that's actually fairly recent. Like in the grand scheme of things, like
we've known about it long enough that we, as mental health folks,
we should know. Right.
But as often tragically is the case, our academians, is that the right word? Academicians, that doesn't.
I love it though.
It's kind of like a magician.
Right.
Academician. The academic, I would make up all sorts of words. Our professors who are training us in many programs are mental health folk who sort of failed at the practice of psychotherapy, counseling, psychology. And so they went into teaching.
I'm going to step away. Are you? That's the claim you're going to make?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Too many of our faculty, those who can do, those who can't teach is the mantra.
I've heard the mantra.
Yeah. Oh, I have no problem saying that.
Okay.
And so what then ends up happening is that sometimes our academies are a little lacking in particularly, for example, in the understanding that very often the most contraindicated treatment for someone with trauma is for them to talk about the trauma.
Mm. Yeah.
One way I say it to my patients is you can tell, I think you can tell when a patient should not be talking about their trauma. When they do in a session, they're telling it in first person, as if it's in real time, and it's as if it's happening right now.
Right.
And the way I will say that to patients, if it feels it's the right way to say it, is, like, that's the last time you will ever tell me that story that way.
Mm-hmm.
Because I just listened to a story that is happening right now.
Right.
And if you were being sexually abused right now, I wouldn't just sit and
Wouldn't
listen.
just sit here. Yeah.
I would intervene. I would stop. And so I'm going to stop you from recounting that story in that way, because your body, your mind, your soul is just re-experiencing it. And the response to abuse is to immediately stop the abuse.
Right.
And so we're going to do all this other work around those traumatic experiences so that you can get to a place that you can tell me that story with the awareness, the full body awareness that that experience is actually in the past.
In the past, right.
And that's really the essence of oh, never mind. We'll come back.
Will we? Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, so this one feels a lot heavier.
Yeah, it is.
Because,
Yeah, because it is.
Feels because it is, right? Yeah, I look forward to how we're going to move forward with discussing all these different things, all these different classifications and how they show up in the world around us, in our own worlds. Yeah. Anything you'd like to add before we go tonight?
No, I don't know. This is about adding. When you were saying it, looking forward to, or well, excuse me, when you were saying how heavy this, not fun or funny,
not playful,
I was thinking about where we're going in the next phase of our podcast, and how fun that's going to, be, how much fun it has already been. And I was thinking of a particular episode.
Oh.
Because I think it will be the episode that we make use of to really illuminate what disorganized attachment might look like.
Oh, yeah.
You know what episode we're talking about? I think you know.
Well, it depends if you're talking about season 1 or season 2.
2.
Okay. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're talking as if people have any clue of what we're going to be doing.
Or
we're being evasive. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderfully evasive and titillating.
But that's to come. We are going to venture into the world of pop culture, whether I drag you kicking and screaming. But yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be fun.
I can't wait.
All right. But this is the wrap up of the introduction to attachment classification, style, strategies, how we live.
Yeah. Hopefully it gives folks some sort of language, some sort of framework, some sort of understanding of these 4 different classifications to understand how people come to be who they are, to understand the kind of experiences they had in their own child, and that we're going to be using and referencing as we explore pop culture through an attachment lens.
There we go.
Because apparently the people be watching TV.
People be watching
movies and things. News to me. Not great.
Well, let's be fair. You watch, you just fall asleep.
First of all, these are private information, and I don't really appreciate all of our 3 listeners knowing that I fall asleep. Yes. No, that's right.
Now, one of my favorite conversations is like, hey, have you seen? And Michael says, oh, I don't watch TV. It's one of those.
I am one of those. But I like to stay relevant, and I like to know what people are doing. And then every once in a while, I get a little hankering for a show.
Yeah.
Or one tickles my fancy.
So we're going to move in the pop culture realm and see how it appears. See how attachment appears. And it appears everywhere.
Absolutely.
Because it is life.
Thanks for another lovely cocktail, Michael.
Yeah. We did another one. You have to take advantage of the blood orange while it's in season. So, cheers.
Cheers.
Signing off. How do we say bye?